Let me start welcoming you. My name is Oliver Schmidt. I'm the Director of the Center for Global Studies here at the University of Victoria. With the great pleasure of welcoming you to this session on the lineages of dispossession, Palestinian land loss across time and geography. Before we start off, I would like to acknowledge with respect that although this is a virtual meeting, we meet, play, and work on the Lekwungen people's territory. The university stands on this territory, and the Songhees and the Squam and the Sanish peoples continue to have strong relationship with the land until today. And today we're going to talk about dispossession of property, of land. And so in a way, it also, this features very large, the unceded territory of the indigenous people on whose territory the University of Victoria stands. So indirectly, we're going to address also these issues, and you can see how the group that put on this session today is very interested in looking at the politics and the history of dispossession and land possession. With this, I would like to introduce Andrew Buck, who will lead us through the discussion today. Andrew is an associate fellow at the Center for Global Studies and also an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Law here at the University of Victoria. Before this, he came to Victoria from Macquarie University in Sydney, where he taught legal history and property law for many years as a professor. And you can see why Andrew has taken on a strong role in this group, in the working group on issues of property and dispossession, because he has a fundamental research interest in the colonial state formation, looking at the British Empire, and currently he works on a bigger project that is entitled Towards a Global History of Dispossession. So Andrew, it's a great pleasure having welcomed you recently to the Center for Global Studies and being able to draw on your expertise on issues of land, property, and dispossession from an historical perspective. So with this, I would like to hand it over to you, Andrew, to lead us into this session today and introduce our speaker for today. Andrew, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver. It's great to be here, and it's great to be able to introduce Dr. Gary Fields. Let me just give you a briefest bit of background. Together with my colleague Martin Bunton, we've been running a property and society discussion group, and this year we thought that we would try and orient the talks broadly around the topic of dispossession. And part of the rationale for this is, for the last couple of years, I've been teaching a course cross-listed between the law school and the Department of History on the legal history of dispossession. And in putting that course together, I cannot emphasize too much how critical and how central was the work of Gary Fields. His book called Enclosure, which came out in 2017, provided me with a fabulous way of orienting and understanding the course, and I'm incredibly indebted to what he's done with that book. And I encourage all of you, if you have the opportunity, to partake of his book Enclosure. It's absolutely brilliant. So it seemed to me that now that we're running an entire year on the question of dispossession, that I couldn't think of anybody more suited to be able to open that session with a presentation on the work that he has done. And I think that you'll agree with me once you've listened to it, how enlightening it is to open a door onto understanding dispossession across time and across space. So Dr. Gary Fields is professor in communication and at the University of California in San Diego. And I'm going to turn it over to him. I would ask if everybody could probably keep their images off, their video off, and their sound off until Dr. Fields has finished, and then we'll open it up for discussion. But Gary, please.
Thank you very much. That was a very generous introduction, and I just wish my mother had been here to listen to it. What I thought I would do in this talk, and that was quite generous of Andrew to say what a pivotal piece of work this is for the class. It's very gratifying to hear that. What I thought I would do is just start off with a little bit of autobiography about this work that I've been doing for actually the last 12 years. And no, this isn't me, by the way, when I say autobiography, but I went to Palestine kind of as a reward for earlier work that I had been doing, completely unrelated to that. And I went with a faculty group in 2004, just as sort of somebody who was interested in the issue. But while I was there, as I toured around and saw things that were just extraordinarily astonishing to me, I began to think about, whether it would be possible to reinvent myself, because I was what you might call a recovering economic geographer at the time. I did my first project on the railroad and telegraph and the internet. And that was an interesting project, but I thought that there might be something else out there after the first big project for me to do. And one of the places that we went, and one of the people that I spoke to at length, was the mayor of a Palestinian town by the name of Qalqilia. And the person I spoke to was the mayor. He took me around the town because the town had achieved some notoriety by 2004, because it was almost completely surrounded by this structure that you see in the background here. And what he spoke very good English. And what he told me is that he used the word enclosed in describing what the people of Qalqilia were experiencing after this structure had been built around his town. And, you know, I was actually, I did economic history as a minor field, as a graduate student. And at the time, I was only 2 years out from graduate school. I knew something about the meaning, or the economic meaning, of enclosure. But believe it or not, it was something that kind of just stuck in my mind and stayed there for about maybe a year and a half. But in the interim, I did go back to some texts that were familiar to me. And one of them, of course, and some of us who are of I would say of a certain age, were brought up in the humanities and social sciences reading things like this. And I certainly was familiar with this. And I knew about chapter 27 of the first volume of Karl Marx's Capital, which is a blistering description of what had happened to the English, the smallholders in England during the course of several centuries. And Marx describes it in very graphic terms. And I began to think about this idea that that we see in Marx here, with my fingers on the page here, about the clearing of the landscape. And at the same time, I began to really think about how can this situation in Palestine be likened to something with a much longer lineage. And so the idea of enclosure just was an alluring thought that stuck in my mind for the first 2 years that I was doing this. And I went back to text of John Locke, who of course is usually credited with being one of the theoreticians of enclosure. He wasn't. I mean, enclosures had been going on long before Locke. But what Locke seemed to do that was unique is that Locke gave all of the prior theorization he sort of pulled it together in 1690 and came up with a very systematic notion about rights to landed property. And of course, it's an iconic text. Many of us probably know it. And these are some of just the most, poignant quotations from his chapter on property. And what I also knew about this chapter, by the way, is that there are many, many references in this chapter, not only to waste and land improvement, but there's many references to what Locke called the wild Indian, because Locke, of course, was an official of the Carolina colony and was a very fervent and ardent promoter of colonization himself, sort of following in the footsteps of people like Richard Hakluyt. And Locke, he sort of describes this generalized theory about land improvement and wasteland as these sort of contrary phenomena occurring on the land. And it gives a really, really sort of general description of what entitles one to landed property. But again, this discussion had been going on well before Locke, but Locke really kind of symbolizes this notion of wasteland being turned into property. What was also beginning to interest me as I got into the project, though, was that this discourse about neglected and unimproved land seemed to also describe a lot of what the early Zionists were at least encountering in Palestine. And they talked about it. And of course, the individual most notorious for this is the very early Zionist, Theodor Herzl, who only went to Palestine once, but wrote about it as if it was a desert wasteland. And this description that Herzl first frames in 1896 and then later in a couple of later works, this was one of the signature discourses among early Zionists, that the Zionist movement was coming back to improve a land that had been neglected and left in waste. And what was also interesting, and I think Martin might appreciate this, is that by 2007, when I first encountered Martin Bunton's incredible book about the British Mandate, what was also striking to me was how Zionism's early patrons, the British, were also describing Palestine in a similar kind of discourse. They were talking about land improvement, and they were also denigrating a form of common and collective and cooperative property that prevailed in Palestine at the time, called the Mushah. And so what I had after a couple of years, actually, what I seemed to have is a common discourse about a land that was seemingly neglected, unimproved, and ideas about who are the rightful owners of land lying in waste. And so I framed kind of an argument about where Palestine could be situated in terms of a much longer historical genealogy of understanding the Palestinian landscape. And what I said in the book, and what the central argument of the book basically is that what we see on the Palestinian landscape today is part of a pattern of dispossession in which groups with territorial ambitions seize the land of others and justify the taking of it by referring to that land as land lying in waste. I called the practice enclosure because it seemed that there were many common features between what English estate owners were doing and what the Zionists were doing. What I also uncovered during the course of years of doing the actual research is that this process had a couple of features that seemed to be common across 3 case studies. In the first place, there was a transfer of vast portions of the landscape from one group of people to another. The clearance of these people from the land, as Marx had intimated in Capital. And then what remained was an ever-shrinking space on the landscape for those who were disinherited, and a much larger area of impassable space that was off limits to them. What I want to kind of emphasize today in this talk is that I want to emphasize one other finding in the book that I thought was probably one of the most compelling and maybe the most interesting for discussion. Because what I found is that there were, in all 3 cases that I looked at here, there were 3 fundamental instruments that enabled this massive land transfer to occur. One was the law, one was maps, and one was built forms on the landscape itself. And what I argued is that they work in tandem as instruments for dispossession. Now, what I also want to argue to you, and I know this is a group interested in property law, but I'm kind of interested in what you all might think about this. But what I seem to have uncovered in the course of doing the book is that these instruments and the process of dispossession seem to be set in motion by a discourse about the benefits of improving land lying in waste and taking possession of it. So that is the general frame of the talk. Now, just for some theory about the talk, there's 3 areas of theory, and I'm going to go through this quickly because theory is not something we could get into it in the discussion, but it's very hard to present theory. But there's 3 fundamental ideas that guided the research here and that guide my thinking about dispossession. In the first place, I sort of borrowing something from Edward Said, who in turn I think borrows from figures as diverse as E.P. Thompson and Max Weber. The idea of colonizing places, what Said says, it occurs because of the materiality of land. But what Said suggests is that seizing it involves a certain outlook of coveting. And this process of coveting in turn involves reimagining the landscape and imagining oneself as the improver of a land supposedly lying in waste. So the theoretical point of entry here is really that materialism is the ultimate sort of impulse behind our actions. But like what E.P. Thompson and even Weber suggested, human action is contingent upon the mental universe of the actors in question. So the mental, what I'm arguing here is that there is a mental universe that inspires the coveting of land. And that mental universe is in turn animated by this idea of improving it. Second, I have this notion of maps not as reflections of territory, but as projections of an outcome on territory. And there are a lot in geography. There's a lot of theorists. Brian Harley is usually associated with this, but the one that I like is Thongchai Winnichakal in his book about Siam, where he says a map anticipates a spatial reality, not vice versa. In other words, a map is a model for, not a model of what it purports to represent. And then finally, and this is from the work of a number of theorists, but I list Nick Blomley, the Komaroffs, and Robert Cover. I see the law as an instrument of violence. And there's another good work out there that I use extensively, and that's Stuart Banner's work. But what Banner, he did a great book about how the Indians lost their land. But what he suggests is that law and violence are on opposite ends of a continuum, and that there's law on the one hand and there's bodily brutality on the other. And I would suggest that those two opposite ends are much more entangled than we might think. I don't know if Nick Blomley is here, but for this graphic, by the way, just a lighter moment here. I looked on Amazon, and there is an entry for his article, Law, Property, and the Geography of Violence. The cost of that is $768, but you can get a used copy apparently for $618. Anyway, and those are the theoretical points of entry for the talk. Now, my story actually begins in England, as I sort of hinted, and it begins really in the 16th century. And what you have in the 16th century is you have kind of a challenge to something called the Statute of Merton, which goes back to the 13th century. You get what becomes a snowballing discourse about the economic advantages of land improvement. Before the 16th century, this was not such an important matter, but as capitalist development begins to get legs, the idea of profiting off land takes a new kind of importance. And what you see in the early 16th century onward is a constant rush of husbandry manuals. And by the end of the century, you have what's called a revolution in cartography. And the idea of these husbandry manuals is to promote among the large estate owners the idea of making land more efficient. And the theme that begins to appear first in this work by John Fitzherbert in 1523 is the idea of enclosing the land to make it, instead of cooperative, to make it private. That is, the landowner seizing control of those areas of the manor which in the Statute of Merton had been sort of left aside for tenants to do common grazing. The idea here was to eliminate those common rights on the common lands, to take possession of it so that the land could be cultivated or used for a more beneficial economic advantage. And I can't underestimate to you the importance of these manuals. I mean, here Fitzherbert's, for instance, goes through 17 editions by his Book of Husbandry and the accompanying Book of Surveying, goes through 17 editions by the end of the century. I mean, most of us would be happy with a second edition of our book, but this thing just, and others follow in the wake of Fitzherbert's same story. Just to give you an idea of what what was being described in the survey manual here, this map toward the latter part of the 16th century, the map by Ralph Agus. What you can see, this is just a tiny sliver of a map that has 26 sheets that's spread out over 5 tables at the British Library, if you get a chance to see it. But what you can see on the map is that the landowner, for the first time, is able to see their land holdings in a new graphic way. This is what mapping actually does. It provides the estate owner not with a textual description of land, but with a cartographic and really a graphic picture. So the owner can see where the copyholds are, where the freeholds are, and make, as Agus describes, make the readiest cut. That is, if enclosure is what is inspiring the landowner, where can the landowner make the cut? That is, cut out the copyhold tenants, maybe buy out the freehold tenants. So this is sort of the map as projection. What can this land actually be? The other element about the improvement discourse that I want to bring your attention to, it begins as early as the early 17th century in another famous text of a surveyor by the name of John Norden. And Norden, what Norden did that was very interesting and unique is that he he understood that there could be tension between the estate owner and the tenant on the manor who was being enclosed. And so he set up a text which was an imaginary conversation between those two actors. But what he also did in this text is he also emphasized that the commons and the commoners who used common land were something akin to savagery, something associated with idleness, beggary, and even disobedience to God and king. So what you have in the early 17th century in this improvement discourse is you have the association of those tenants, commoners who used common land, with the idea that they are kind of unruly savages. This is something that's completely new and different by the early 17th century. And somehow, they're not only wasting land, but something should be done about them. But the one who really promotes, the one who is really most famous in promoting enclosure is somebody who most of us have probably heard of because of his the travels in France and all these texts. But Arthur Young, by the end of the 18th century, is probably the most famous promoter of the idea of enclosing lands. And he outlines this in a text most succinctly called Political Arithmetic. And he says it's enclosures alone, that is the making of private property, that is enabling the country to improve agriculture on a grand scale. Because by the 18th century, the idea of land improvement and enclosure had actually become part of the national interest. As England had become a colonizing power, the idea of an enhanced and improved national agriculture had become part of a national political agenda. And Young says it's by making private property that our agriculture can become as productive as it can be. The one who probably explains most clearly, though, why the country needed enclosure was the president of the Board of Agriculture, a landowner by the name of Sir John Sinclair. And he likens this to, it's an incredible quote. He says, in 1803, he says, we've begun a campaign against the foreign enemies. What about something against our great domestic foe? And then he says, let us not be satisfied with conquering Egypt or Malta, but let us subdue the Finchley Common. Let them submit to the yoke of improvement. So the idea of somehow the idea of improving land, making private property, making agriculture more productive, eliminating the commons because it's unproductive, has become elevated to the level of a national concern and really a national discourse. Now there were changes in the law, and what I'm interested in arguing to you, and I'd be curious to hear your responses to this, but what I would argue is that the legal revolution in England that was part of this enclosure momentum, that this generally followed the expansion in the improvement discourse, and that it was something that followed later. And these legal changes actually bring the system of law in line with national sentiment. And I mean, there are many, many different legal artifacts here that we could cite, and I listed just three. And that is, of course, the Parliamentary Enclosure Acts, 5,000 of them, the Black Acts that criminalize efforts by dispossessed commoners to use land that they once used in common, and then an actual path-breaking court case in the Court of Common Pleas that outlawed the time-honored practice of what was called gleaning and defined much more completely the notion of trespass on private land. So lawfare, the idea of bringing the law in here to align symmetrically with what had gone on before as a matter of discourse, is something that occurs over the course of the 18th century. What about the impacts of all this? Now, surprisingly enough, Arthur Young kind of found God in his later years, and he, in contrast to his earlier work, said, my goodness, this process of enclosure is actually injuring 19 out of 20 enclosure acts, the poor are injured. And the idea here is that this whole process of enclosure was beginning to clear those tenant farmers off the land. Where did they go? Well, many of them went back or stayed on the land as agricultural wage earners, but many of them, of course, went into the newly developing factory system of England at the time. So there was this process of these copyhold tenants being moved en masse off of agriculture. What was also occurring on the landscape was something that I actually took initially from Nick Blomley's extremely interesting article about the work of hedges. Hedges, walls, and fences were being built by these estate owners to basically not only to concretize and symbolize this transition to landed property, but it also had a very practical effect of creating physical impediments to the right to roam, a right that had been associated with the common economy for centuries, the right to freely circulate across the landscape. And I want to just end this particular part of the talk with this painting by David Hockney, which is kind of an interesting aesthetic rendition of the hedged and enclosed landscape here in the background. I mean, you get this free movement in the foreground, but it sort of ends with this representation of the hedges. And what I would submit to you is the representation, this hedged background in Hockney's painting actually reflects a transition to a so-called improved privatized landscape. This is the physical form that this actually takes that begins to partition and fracture the land. Not surprisingly, this discourse about land improvement is brought over. It does not simply rest in the countryside of England, but it's brought over by the Anglo colonists to the New World when they begin to colonize North America. And the Robert Gray is one of the early proponents of this idea that the population in the New World really do not, they inhabit an unpropertied landscape. They don't have any notions of mine or yours, so that we can impose a system of property on them that would not injure them really in any way. Similar kind of perspective that was expressed by John Winthrop. Of course, they couldn't actually take the land at the time from the Native Americans. They didn't have the physical force to do that. So that they did what Banner suggests that they did. They actually, for the most part, they negotiated with the Native Americans for land purchases. But of course, there were skirmishes with them. Now, the English colonists from a very early time had an idea, though, that this was, in fact, destined to be English land. And this is represented in this map, early map of New England of 1616 by John Smith, where he labels all of this area that was essentially Narragansett and Wampanoag. He labels it with English names and therefore projecting kind of an English character to this fundamentally Amerindian landscape. When the English begin to colonize, as William Cronin sort of tells us about in his book, Changes in the Land, as the English expand colonization across the continent, they bring a particular physical feature to the landscape that Cronin describes as a world of fields and fences. It's very similar in many ways to what the estate owners were doing on the English landscape with the hedgerow walls and fences there. They begin to take land, dispossessing Native Americans and pushing them. And we can see by the middle of the 18th century, the Oneida Iroquois chief Tanaquison complained to William Johnson that the Oneida really they had no place to go because the impediments to free movement on the landscape were so dense that the Oneida could no longer hunt or collect bark for their residences. Where this discourse begins to intersect with the law, we can see really clearly in this very famous work by Hugh Henry Brackenridge at the beginning of the 19th century. And the idea here is that the thin and scattered settlements of the Indians are really, these are not really, this is not real property here. The most that the Indians can claim are the spots where they have their wigwams, as he says. And he says, we could encroach on the territory claimed by them until they are reduced to smaller bounds. So already by this time, and you know, the idea of physically and forcefully removing Native Americans from territory being colonized is already being discussed in 1803 by President Jefferson after the Louisiana Purchase. That is, where to move the Native Americans on the landscape. Where can we move them after we have settled that and created property on that landscape? In 1816, sort of a vision about this, a vision of this westward thrust of the settler homesteads is articulated in this map of the United States by John Malish. And at the time, actually the boundary of the United States is running roughly north-south from Lake Michigan down through here. But Malish's map, what he says in an accompanying description of his map, and he says, this map really shows us or gives us an idea of what the United States will be in the future. And it shows the probable expansion of the white race from east to west. And we find an agreeable resting point here on the West Coast. And, we might think, oh, okay, that's interesting. But what's interesting to me, or one of the interesting things to me about the Malish map, in addition to the design, the idea of projection here, is that the map went through 20 editions from 1816 to 1823. And even Thomas Jefferson sent Malish a congratulatory letter saying that the map was really quite an achievement in outlining the destiny of the United States. What happened here, and I kind of apologize, this is in many ways an American-centric presentation of the Native Americans, but it's what I know. But in any case, what were the changes in the law that kind of kept up with this? There's many we can choose from, but I list three here. And that is, of course, the very famous American Supreme Court case of Johnson in 1823 that basically designates Native Americans as tenants. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, a piece of legislation that was really a show of force. And again, the Indian Appropriations Act of 1851, which essentially started the reservation system for Native Americans. So what you get with these three elements of the law here is you get the sweeping of Native Americans from the land and the pushing of Native Americans into smaller and smaller spaces, as we see on this map of Indian reservations in 1883. Native Americans, of course, had possession of all of this territory and now are being pushed into smaller and smaller pockets of land on the landscape. I also wanted to draw our attention to the landscape seen from above. What happens as part of this process is the landscape assumes the physical character of property. It becomes rectilinear, geometric in form, and we can see it here. I mean, if you take an airline flight from coast to coast, you can see the broad swaths of this. But really, what's embedded in this image is an image of this is actually dispossession. It's an image of the takeover of Amerindian land and the reconstitution of that land into the grid, as Nick Blomley would describe it. Here is the grid, and it's a grid that is steeped in blood and violence. Finally, I'm going to wrap up real quickly here. I've gone a little bit over my time now by 5 minutes, but just give me 5 more minutes and we can wrap up. I was, as I told you in the beginning of this talk, I was struck by the similarity, the symmetry in the sound of the discourse promoted by Locke and what I was hearing from early Zionists like Herzl. I mean, the best one to me is Aaron David Gordon, and you can read it here on the screen. I mean, Gordon seems to have mimicked many of the elements in Locke about who is deserving and undeserving of the land. When Gordon says, whoever works harder, creates more, gives more of the spirit, will acquire greater moral right and a deeper vital interest in the land, Gordon had no doubts that it was the Zionists who would prevail in a competition with the Palestinians. The point that I just want to make here is that from a very early time, the Zionists were steeped in this idea of the undeserving and those who are deserving because they improve the land. But what I also want to just tell you is that they didn't make this up. They had this already from American and English travelers to Palestine who contributed pieces of this discourse about a barren and neglected landscape, even though this illustration from Mark Twain's famous book doesn't, this is an illustration from one of the early editions. The illustration doesn't seem to suggest that, but Twain and others who followed gave Zionists an almost unending string of ideas about a landscape that was unproductive and unimproved. And what the Zionists proceed to do is that they take this discourse and they create a cartographic reality about it in these two different kinds of maps. The one on the left is a more scientific map that was done by the Jewish National Fund. And what these maps show is they both show a relatively empty land. There's some evidence of Palestinian towns on the map on the left, none here on the right really. But what these maps were used for is that they were used, and the Zionists were not bashful about this, they were used as propaganda, as recruitment tools for colonists to come to a land that the Zionists advertised as empty and unimproved. Now, the Zionists knew better, but this is how they represented it. It's interesting that one of the first things that the State of Israel does after the establishment of Israel in 1948, one of the first things they do, that Ben-Gurion does, is he appoints a commission to create a new map of Palestine. The map will now be known as Eretz Israel, and Arab names from that map will be changed into Hebrew names. In other words, Ben-Gurion understood the importance of projecting the idea of land through maps. And what Ben-Gurion wanted to project was a land that was Hebrew in character. Lawfare. How did the new state of Israel use the law to its advantage in dispossessing? They used it in a very overt and blatant fashion. The first big, and they used many, many laws, and this is the most obvious one. They used something called absentee property law, which went through several iterations between 1949 and 1951. Essentially, just to go through this briefly, there were approximately 800,000 Palestinians who were made refugees outside the boundaries of what became the State of Israel. And those, they were the majority of the population of Israel at the time. And those refugees lived in about 400 towns and villages represented on the map on the right with these red dots. After the war was concluded in 1949, all of those towns were essentially emptied, depopulated. So what the state of Israel did to recast that whole area is that they created a new status of personhood called absentees. And the absentee would be those people who essentially were not, you were an absentee if you moved from your place of residence where you were in 1947. There were still some Palestinians who were moved from their residence but remained within the borders. Those Palestinians had a slightly different designation, and you can't make this up. They were present absentees. Essentially, the state of Israel created a custodian of absentee property with the power to seize the landed property of the absentees, both absentees and present absentees who could not prove that they were the owners of land. And with basically with the stroke of a pen, they were able to dispossess about 950,000 Palestinians of their land. One more thing that I want to say before I break here, because this is kind of important. The state of Israel did that within the boundaries of the state of Israel. But what did they do after 1967 in the areas that came under their control after the Six-Day War? Well, they used something, a kind of remnant of the Ottoman land law of 1858 to designate land in the West Bank as land that was essentially what they called mawat, or dead, that is land without ownership. And land without ownership in the West Bank was land that had less than 50% coverage, or less than 50% cultivation, as this hilltop does here. And so that kind of land could be designated as land belonging to the new empire, that is the successor empire to the Ottoman Empire, the State of Israel. And the State of Israel used that to begin settling those areas of the landscape, mostly hilltops, with new Jewish settlements, so that when you go to the West Bank, you see a landscape that often looks like this: a Jewish settlement on the top of a hill, a Palestinian town at the base of the hill. What they also did is that since the mid-90s, the State of Israel has created basically a landscape filled with barriers, walls, fences, and impassable space. As we see here, a wall that basically is surrounding the city of Bethlehem in the foreground, ostensibly separating this Israeli settlement of Har Homa in the background. What is this? What is this creating essentially? What this has created is a shrinking, impassable space of dispossessed Palestinians, as we see on this map. We see a large map essentially of ownership by the State of Israel, some partitioned and fragmented enclaves of where Palestinians exist, and a very difficult and impassable kind of geographical landscape where these people exist. So what do these three cases that I put together in this book, that is the English case, the Native American case, the Palestinian case, what have I tried to argue to you? What I've tried to show in the broad sense is the making of private property, the making of white property, and the making of Hebrew land spring from similar impulses and similar instruments. And all of them sort of bear witness to a process of reimagining the landscape through a discourse of land improvement. And this discourse offers very strident condemnations of those whose land is judged to be unimproved and reasons why they are undeserving, and why the taking of such land is desirable. All three cases witness the transfer of vast portions of the landscape from one group to another, and that property law, maps, and these physical impediments built into the landscape work in tandem as instruments for dispossessing the undeserving of their holdings. The question that I put for you is it a model? And I put it to you because my answer to this is that it could be, but I'm not sure because I've only studied these three cases. I think Martin, in his book, goes into much more detailed descriptions of how for instance, the Twain system worked in various different environments. Maybe there are some ways in which this model could be applicable to other environments of dispossession, but I think we might be able to use this as a starting point for at least investigating it. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Gary. That was really interesting. I mean, really great. Listen, could I ask if people have got questions? The first step is if you've got a question, could you put your video on so I can identify you? And then once I call upon you, then perhaps you might ask you a question. So are there questions based on what Gary has been saying to us? Perhaps questions about what he ended with, which is this true in other jurisdictions that some of us might be familiar with?
Andrew,
Yes.
Andrew, I'm having trouble getting video because it says the host has closed it down.
Is that right? Is that right?
Yeah, it says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Well,
anyway, I can ask
Jody, are you out there, Jody? I'm sorry, Matt.
I am Andrew, and it says he has permission, so I'm just.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So
but it's okay. Voice is great, John. Please.
Yeah, this is John McLaren. Less severely doubt about it. I thought that was terrific, Gary, and thank you so much. One thing that I'm interested in is the extent to which in this process of dispossession of land, the extent to which people who have formerly not enjoyed land as a independent commodity, once they move to colonial areas or new parts of the world, invest very heavily in the new order. And I say that because of a book I read in Australia called Caledonia Australis, which I think, Andrew, was written by an advisor to Paul Keating, sometime Prime Minister of Australia, which makes the point that settlers to Australia, particularly in New South Wales from Scotland and Ireland, who had been in some instances dispossessed from their land, became the new landlords of this land and did everything they could to see that the original possessors were pushed off, marginalized, and in some instances destroyed as they made their claim to the land. And I wonder just how much of a phenomenon that is in the the historical work you've done. In other words, people who were victims of dispossession become the protagonists of dispossession.
Well, I mean, I think that yeah, I'm not, can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Oh, okay, because my thing seems to be doing some funny things. You know, the classic case of this is probably the situation. I mean, people like to point to the Zionists, of course, those who were victimized by the Second World War, coming back and doing similar things that, I mean, they were, you know, a lot of the Jews were essentially dispossessed. I mean, they were killed for the most part, but certainly dispossessed. And then coming back and doing some similar things that seemed awfully similar. You know, I mean, one thing, I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but one thing that I didn't get into, my presentation did make it sound like this was, you know, well, for the sake of simplicity, I kind of glossed over the fact that this process is not one of a grim reaper without any kind of agency on the part of the dispossessed. They always resist. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about the story. And I tried to tell some of that story in the book, but the idea that there's resistance to this process in all cases, and sometimes the resistors are defeated and broken, and I guess, you know, maybe some of those commoners, or, you know, from England, maybe I don't know, maybe they came over and became pioneers or something and settlers in the United States. And I guess what I'm saying is I'm not completely familiar with how that would work, and I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that question. Maybe.
Nick, you've got a question.
Yes, can you hear me, Gary?
I can hear, I just can't see for some reason.
I'm so pleased to discover that I'm richer than I thought. Now that I have all this money I'm going to make from my new book on
just go to the
Amazon.
Amazon. Just go to the Amazon site right now, and your book is selling for $7.68, but used for only $6.18. So.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, this is so I've learned many things, but this is one good thing. Thank you for your presentation. We've of course, you know, talked about this work for some time, and I had the good fortune of reading the manuscript earlier on. So the details that you provide are just so fascinating and immensely useful. I guess I want to kind of push back a little bit against this idea of a model at two levels. One, to talk about law, maps, and physical instruments. To me seems, I wonder if it isn't potentially a bit reductive, because these stand in for things, surely. I mean, so we're thinking about law, we're thinking about state, or the mobilization of the state. If we're thinking about maps, then for me, I think be thinking about sort of spatial imaginaries more generally, which would include maps, but also could include, you know, Mark Twain. And for the physical, the material, the physical, you know, the fences and so on, I suppose they stand in for me in place of something to do with corporeality and movement. So I wondered what your thoughts were on that, whether these were sort of, maybe it's better to think about those broader categories rather than, you know, the map in and of itself. Or, but my second point is that I'm not convinced that we need a model. You know, what would a model be serving? And would a model not miss the inevitable specificities and differences that unfold in particular places that need to be attended to? I mean, so dispossession on Vancouver Island is and was different than dispossession in other places. Granted, there are some similarities, but I'm not sure why we need a model, I suppose, is my and that's a sort of maybe more a sort of, you know, ambivalence towards grand theory.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And maybe I can answer it this way. I came to the, I mean, maybe it's not a model. I mean, you know, economists understand models as something that you can demonstrate through calculations. But the question that I asked myself at the beginning of this is whether the situation in Palestine could be understood in a broader historical context, because one of the big arguments that's made about Palestine is that it is a completely unique situation and a completely unique case. It doesn't have any relationship to other kinds of cases. The situation there is just, we have to put it off as to the side as some kind of outlier. And I attempted to push back against that. That was the motivation really at the outset for the book, because many people, I mean, we could, yes, indeed, there are many ways in which each specific case of dispossession has its own unique attributes. I think that that's clear. And in the concluding chapter to this book, I said that. But I think what makes the phenomenon of dispossession interesting is how we can glean patterns from different cases that are seemingly so different and disparate across time and geography. And it seemed to me that this improvement discourse and the way that each of these actor groups with power used these various instruments, it seemed that there was enough symmetry in these to suggest that the Palestinian case was not isolated at all, that it followed an enduring lineage of land conflict, and that that we could understand the Palestinian case in this context, and we could remove it from this insulation that it seems to enjoy as something unique, something beyond critique. So if we could say that the estate owner, that the colonist, that the Zionist are somehow doing similar things, that could enlighten us as to what was actually going on there. That was, if that is a too overtly political mission, I plead guilty. But I tried to, I tried to put in the research here that would not make it a political argument, because I tried to, I mean, my style here is really kind of to be kind of detached. So that was my mission. That was to try and place the Palestinian situation in a context where it was perhaps part of a broader and more enduring lineage, so that we could make some sense of it in terms of historical precedent. Not to say that each individual case is different and has its own unique characteristics. I completely agree. But I think, I mean, I guess I'm kind of a comparisonist. You know, I used to call myself a Marxist. Now I call myself a comparisonist. But I mean, anyway, I think that what's interesting are the broad patterns of similarity and continuity over time, along with change. I mean, change to me, change and uniqueness to me seem self-evident. But what is not self-evident, at least in my view, is how seemingly very different things are sometimes more similar than we might think.
Gary, I'd like to move on because we're running out of time, but we've got time for one last question, and the question is for Anna.
Thank you so much. Just honored to be here. I actually took Professor Buck's legal dispossession class. Now it's been 2 years ago, I guess, when I was visiting at UVic Law. So glad to be continuing this conversation. My question is actually kind of similar to Nick's in that I've been really, so I'm Jewish, and I've been really interested in the idea of, you know, what's going on in Palestine and working very actively against the dispossessions that's happening. But I'm also studying federal Indian law now in law school. And so I've been seeing a lot of these overlaps. And one thing I'm curious about is, while you see benefit in these comparisons, I guess to Nick's point, maybe I'm a little bit worried that, I don't know if I'm anti-model necessarily or anti-comparison, but when I hear people, I guess more out of academia, discuss these things and try to reduce these instances down to like one word or you know, certain narratives, I get worried that using a comparative model erases those nuances and distinctions. And so I was wondering, in the difference between, I guess, academia and translating these things to a broader public, if that's what you're interested in, but if just kind of making them more accessible, how you still kind of warn of not oversimplification using this comparative model.
Well, I just try to, I mean, most of the time when I'm doing talks to the community, I try to simply give talks based on my experiences, what I experienced directly, and simply tell the truth. I mean, and so in this talk, I did something differently. I tried to sort of tie these three cases, or summations of these three cases together. But yeah, I mean, look, you can talk about the Israeli settlement project, and you can go into all the legal manifestations that make it happen, and that's an interesting talk. And that's, I mean, those are certainly unique too. I mean, yeah, I guess you can go at this either way. You can compare, or you can emphasize the symmetries, and you can emphasize the unique elements. I don't disagree with any of that. Each case is an individual story, and you can tell those stories in different ways.
Okay, well, I see the time is running away from us.
Oh.
I'd just like to thank Gary very much for a really stimulating talk, an incredibly stimulating talk, and thank you all for being here. And I really hope that as the program goes on for the remainder of the year, we see all of you back once again. But thanks to Gary, and I'm sure you'll join me in putting up our little clap hand. Just thank you.